The storm that night came with a violence befitting the Carpathian Mountains, thunder rolling across the valleys like the drums of some ancient war. Count Dracula stood at the highest window of his castle, watching lightning split the blackened sky, feeling nothing. He had watched 10,000 storms in his centuries of existence, had seen empires rise and crumble like sandcastles before the tide, had tasted the blood of saints and sinners alike until they all merged into the same metallic emptiness. The storm meant nothing. The night meant nothing. His own immortal existence had become nothing more than an endless repetition of darkness, hunger, and the suffocating weight of memories he could neither escape nor fully embrace. Below him in the great hall, his servants were preparing for the monthly gathering. It was a tradition Dracula had established decades ago, a cruel entertainment to break the monotony of eternity. Once each month, his mortal servants would light every candelabra in the castle, prepare tables laden with wine and roasted meats, and send word to the nearby villages that the Count was hosting a ball for travelers and scholars passing through the mountain roads. The villagers whispered warnings, of course, crossed themselves and clutched their crucifixes. But there were always those desperate enough or foolish enough to accept the invitation. Young nobles seeking adventure, merchants hoping for profitable connections, occasionally a priest thinking he might save souls in the devil's own house. They came, they danced, they drank, and by dawn most of them left with hazy memories and strange dreams. Some, the unlucky few whose blood sang with particular sweetness, never left at all. Dracula found the whole charade tedious, but it served its purpose. It kept his servants occupied, maintained the illusion that he was merely an eccentric nobleman, rather than the undead horror he truly was, and provided him with prey that came willingly to his door. But tonight, something felt different. Perhaps it was the violence of the storm, or perhaps it was the crushing weight of another century sliding toward its close, but Dracula felt a restlessness in his bones that even blood could not satisfy. He descended from his tower, moving through the secret passages of the castle with the silence of shadow itself, and made a decision that surprised even him. Tonight, he would not watch from the darkness. Tonight, he would walk among them. The disguise was simple but effective. Dracula had learned long ago that mortals see what they expect to see, and they expected nobility to look a certain way. He dressed in the fashion of a foreign count, his usual severe black replaced with deep burgundy velvet trimmed in silver thread. He covered his pale skin with powder to give it a more human warmth, tinted his lips to hide their bloodless hue, and wore gloves of the finest leather to conceal the inhuman coldness of his touch. Most importantly, he affected the mannerisms of a living man, allowing himself to breathe, though he had no need of air, blinking his eyes at regular intervals, even forcing his long-stilled heart to produce the faintest ghost of a pulse. It was exhausting, this pretense of humanity, but he was curious to see his own castle through mortal eyes, to walk his own halls as a guest, rather than a master. The great hall blazed with light when he entered, hundreds of candles casting dancing shadows across the vaulted ceiling. The gathering was smaller than usual, no doubt because of the storm, but perhaps 24 mortals milled about the space. Dracula recognized the usual types, a cluster of merchants arguing loudly about trade routes, their faces already flushed with wine. A young couple clearly using the ball as an excuse for a romantic tryst, holding hands in a shadowed alcove. An aging scholar with ink-stained fingers examining the tapestries with professional interest. His own servants moved through the crowd like ghosts, offering wine and sweets, their eyes carefully avoiding his, even though he knew they recognized him. They were all bound to him by ancient contracts and older magics, and they would play their parts perfectly. Dracula accepted a goblet of wine from a servant, holding it, but not drinking. The smell of it turned his stomach. Mortal food and drink had been ashes in his mouth for centuries, but the prop was necessary for his disguise. He drifted through the crowd, listening to their conversations with half an ear, marveling at how trivial their concerns seemed. They worried about money, about reputation, about whether the rain would ruin the roads tomorrow. They had no idea they were dancing on the floor of damnation itself, drinking wine poured by hands that had prepared graves, laughing beneath the gaze of a creature that could drain the life from any of them before they could draw breath to scream. It was then that he noticed her. She stood apart from the others, not in the great hall at all, but visible through the doorway that led to the eastern corridor. A young woman, perhaps 25 years old, wearing a traveling dress of dark green wool that marked her as educated, but not wealthy. Her hair was caught in a simple braid, chestnut brown with threads of copper that caught the candlelight. But it was her face that arrested him, the intense concentration in her dark eyes as she stood before the corridor, studying something in her hands. She held a book, ancient by the look of it, and her lips moved silently as she read. Then, with a glance back at the great hall to ensure no one was watching, she slipped into the eastern corridor and disappeared into the shadows. Dracula felt something stir in his chest, some emotion he had thought long dead. Curiosity, perhaps, or something more dangerous. The eastern corridor led to only one place, his private library, a vast collection of forbidden texts that he had gathered over centuries. The door was always locked, sealed with wards that should burn any mortal who tried to touch it, yet this woman had walked toward it with purpose, as if she knew exactly where she was going. He set down his wine goblet and followed, moving with mortal slowness, maintaining his disguise, even though every instinct screamed at him to use his supernatural speed. The corridor was dark, lit only by occasional oil lamps set in iron sconces. The woman moved quickly, her footsteps light but confident, and Dracula hung back, watching her from the shadows. She reached the library door, that massive oak barrier carved with symbols, meant to ward off evil and protect the knowledge within. Dracula expected her to try the handle and find it locked, expected her to give up and return to the gathering. Instead, she reached into her dress and withdrew something that made his dead heart clench with impossible emotion. A key, an ancient iron key with a handle shaped like a cross. The same key he had given to his beloved Elisabeth 4 centuries ago, before the curse, before the transformation, when he had still been a mortal man named Vlad, who believed love could conquer any darkness. The woman fitted the key into the lock, and it turned with a sound like breaking bones. The wards flared briefly, crimson light washing over her face, but they recognized the key and subsided, allowing her entry. She pushed open the door and stepped into the library, and Dracula stood frozen in the corridor, his carefully maintained disguise cracking as emotions he had thought burned away by centuries of darkness came flooding back. How did she have that key? Elisabeth had been buried with it. He had seen her laid to rest in the family crypt, had stood over her grave and sworn that he would join her in death. But then the curse had come, the transformation, and death had been taken from him as cruelly as Elisabeth herself had been. He forced himself to move, to follow her into the library. The vast room stretched before them, walls lined floor to ceiling with shelves that held the accumulated knowledge of ages. Texts in Latin and Greek, Arabic and Hebrew, languages long dead and some that had never been meant for human tongues, grimoires bound in human leather, treatises on alchemy and necromancy, histories of empires that had crumbled to dust, and poetry that had driven its authors to madness. The woman moved through this collection with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she sought, her fingers trailing along spines until she found a particular volume bound in black leather. She pulled it from the shelf, carried it to the reading table, and opened it with hands that trembled slightly. Dracula watched from the doorway, still hidden in shadow. The book she had chosen was one of his most dangerous possessions, a manuscript copied from an original that dated back to the time of ancient Rome. It was written in a mixture of Latin and something older, something that predated the empire itself, and it dealt with the nature of curses and their undoing. He had studied that book obsessively in his first century of undeath, searching desperately for some way to break the curse that bound him. But he had found nothing but frustration and empty promises. What could this mortal woman hope to find in its pages? She read with intense concentration, her lips moving as she worked through the archaic language. Dracula found himself drawn forward despite his caution, moving into the library proper, angling to see her face more clearly. There was something familiar about her features, something that tugged at memories he had tried to bury. The shape of her jaw, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, even the gesture she made of tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was painfully, impossibly similar to Elisabeth, but that was absurd. Elisabeth had died 400 years ago, had been mortal and remained mortal, bones and dust in a tomb that Dracula could not bear to visit. The woman reached a particular passage and her breath caught. She leaned closer to the text, tracing the words with one finger, and Dracula saw tears begin to slide down her cheeks. She was crying silently as she read, and the sight of those tears struck him with more force than any holy relic could have managed. When had he last seen someone weep? When had he last cared? He had made countless mortals cry over the centuries, had drunk their tears along with their blood, had felt nothing but the savage satisfaction of the predator. But these tears were different. These tears spoke of grief that matched his own, of loss that transcended time. Then she did something that shattered the last remnants of his composure. She reached into her dress again and withdrew a locket, old silver tarnished with age, and opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was a miniature portrait, the paint faded but still visible. Dracula did not need to see it clearly to know what it depicted. His own face stared back at him from that tiny painting. His mortal face, the face of the man he had been before the curse. He had commissioned that portrait himself, had given it to Elisabeth as a wedding gift, and she had promised to wear it always, close to her heart. The woman looked at the portrait, then back at the book, and her lips moved. She was speaking, though her voice was barely a whisper, reading from the ancient text. Dracula moved closer, no longer caring about his disguise, drawn by a compulsion he could not name. He had to hear what she was saying, had to understand why this mortal woman carried Elisabeth's locket and Elisabeth's key and wept over texts that dealt with breaking curses that could not be broken. Her voice grew slightly stronger as she read, the Latin words falling from her lips, with a pronunciation that was archaic but perfect. She was reading a passage he knew by heart, had memorized in his desperate early years. It spoke of curses born from love, corrupted, of how the deepest damnation came not from evil, but from good turned twisted. It spoke of redemption being possible only through the voluntary sacrifice of one who loved without condition, who would surrender everything for the sake of the damned. Empty words, meaningless philosophy, Dracula had decided long ago. There was no redemption for creatures like him. There was only the endless night and the hunger that never ceased. But then the woman reached the end of the passage and spoke 3 words that were not part of the text, 3 words in that same archaic Latin that hit Dracula like a physical blow. 3 words he had not heard in 4 centuries, 3 words that Elisabeth had whispered to him on her deathbed as fever consumed her, and he knelt helpless at her side, unable to save her with all his mortal strength and noble title. 3 words that had been meant for him alone, a secret between their souls. Maneo tecum semper. I remain with you always. Dracula froze. The careful disguise he had maintained shattered completely. His breathing stopped, his forced heartbeat ceased, and the powder that warmed his skin seemed to crack and fall away. He stood revealed in the candlelight, pale as death, motionless as a statue, every inch of him screaming the truth of what he was. A corpse walking, a dead thing pretending to be alive, a monster wearing the shell of a man. The woman sensed him somehow. Perhaps she felt the change in the air, or perhaps some instinct warned her she was no longer alone. She turned slowly, the locket still in one hand and the ancient book open before her, and her eyes met his across the shadowed expanse of the library. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Dracula waited for the scream, for the terror, for her to run or faint or call for help. But she did none of those things. Instead, she studied his face with those dark eyes that were so painfully familiar, and something like recognition flickered across her features. When she spoke, her voice was steady, despite the tears that still traced paths down her cheeks. "Tell me your name," she said. "Not the title, not the name they call you now, but the name you were given when you were born mortal and loved by God. Tell me who you were before the darkness claimed you." Dracula wanted to flee, to vanish into shadow as he had done 10,000 times before. But those 3 words had trapped him more surely than any holy symbol or prayer. Maneo tecum semper. How could she know those words? How could she speak them with Elisabeth's exact intonation, with the same mixture of love and sorrow that had broken his heart 4 centuries ago? He forced himself to speak, his voice rough from the shock, from the emotions tearing through him like knives. "I was called Vlad," he said. "I was a prince of Wallachia, a defender of Christendom, a husband who loved his wife more than his own soul. I was a man who believed in justice and mercy and the power of faith. I was a fool who thought he could protect those he loved through strength of arms and purity of purpose." The woman nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had already known. She closed the book with care, marking the page with a ribbon, and then she set down the locket beside it. She faced him fully, squaring her shoulders, and he saw that she was trembling, but not from fear. From something else, something that might have been resolve, or perhaps anticipation. "My name is Elena," she said. "I am the last daughter of the Bathory line, descended from your wife's sister through 10 generations. Elisabeth gave that locket and that key to her sister before she died, along with instructions that were passed down through our family like a sacred trust. She made us promise that one day, when the time was right, one of us would come to this castle and speak the words that only you would recognize. She said that when you heard those words again, spoken by one of her blood, it would be a sign that redemption was still possible, that love had not died with her, but lived on through the generations." Dracula felt something crack inside him, some barrier he had built around what remained of his heart. This could not be real. It had to be some trick, some elaborate trap designed by the church or by some vampire hunter, clever enough to know his history. But as he looked at Eleanor, at the tears on her face, and the locket that had once rested against Elisabeth's heart, he knew it was true, knew it with a certainty that transcended logic. "Why now?" he whispered. "Why? After 400 years of silence, 400 years of darkness, does her family send you to me now?" Elena reached out and touched the book before her, that ancient text on curses and their breaking. "Because," she said, "the curse has grown weaker. Whatever dark power bound you to this existence, it has begun to fade. The signs are there in the old texts, in prophecies and portents that our family has studied for generations. You have suffered long enough, Vlad. Elisabeth believed that your soul could be saved, that the man she loved was still somewhere inside the monster. She left us the tools and the knowledge to help you, if you are willing to be helped. But first you must make a choice." "What choice?" Dracula asked, though part of him already knew the answer, dreaded it and longed for it in equal measure. Elena met his eyes, unflinching despite what he was. "You must choose whether to continue as you are, hunting and killing and drowning in darkness until the last star burns out, or whether to fight for the redemption Elisabeth believed you deserved. The path will not be easy. It will require sacrifice and pain and confronting every evil deed you have committed in 4 centuries of undeath. But it is possible. The curse can be broken. You can die as a man rather than as a monster. You can rest beside Elisabeth in consecrated ground. You can find peace." The word peace seemed to echo in the vast library, bouncing off ancient tomes and forbidden knowledge, filling the air with impossible promise. Dracula had not known peace since the night of his transformation, had forgotten what it felt like to sleep without the hunger gnawing at him, to look at another living soul without calculating how their blood would taste. Peace seemed as distant and mythical as heaven itself, a paradise denied to creatures like him. But as he looked at Elena, standing brave and tearful in his library with Elisabeth's locket in her hand, he felt something he had not felt in 400 years. Hope, fragile and painful, and probably foolish, but hope nonetheless. The silence that followed Eleanor's words stretched between them like a chasm, vast and terrible. Dracula stood motionless, centuries of predatory instinct warring with something deeper, something he had thought destroyed by time and bloodshed. Hope was a dangerous thing for a creature of darkness. Hope could wound more deeply than any stake, could torture more exquisitely than holy water. He had learned long ago that the cruelest torment was not the hunger or the isolation, or even the guilt. It was the faint whisper that perhaps things could have been different, that perhaps redemption was just beyond his grasp. He had crushed that whisper ruthlessly, had drowned it in blood, and embraced his damnation fully because acceptance was easier than yearning for what could never be. But now this woman, this daughter of Elisabeth's bloodline, stood before him offering exactly what he had convinced himself was impossible. The words she spoke were precisely calculated to pierce whatever armor he had built around his corrupted heart. She offered Not just redemption, but rest. Not just forgiveness, but reunion with the one soul he had loved above all others. It was too perfect, too precisely aimed at his deepest wound. Every instinct of his long existence screamed that this was a trap, that no salvation came without some hidden price that would prove worse than damnation itself. He forced himself to speak, his voice emerging as barely more than a rasp. "How do you know this will work? What proof do you have that the curse can truly be broken? I have studied every text in this library, consulted with demons and angels alike when they would deign to speak to such as me, and I have found nothing but empty promises and philosophical riddles. What makes you so certain that your family's ancient instructions are anything more than the desperate hope of a dying woman who could not accept that her husband was lost forever?" Eleanor did not flinch from his harsh words. Instead, she turned back to the book before her and opened it to a different page, one marked with a thin ribbon of faded red silk. The pages were covered in dense Latin script, interspersed with diagrams that hurt to look at directly, geometric shapes that seemed to twist impossibly in the candlelight. She pointed to a particular passage, and Dracula found himself drawn closer despite his wariness. This text was written by a priest named Methodius in the 7th century, Elena said. He was a scholar of curses and their origins, and he documented cases of vampirism across the Eastern Empire. But unlike most holy men who simply called for destruction of the afflicted, Methodius studied the mechanism of the curse itself. He believed that vampirism was not a gift from demons, but a perversion of the natural order, a wound in the fabric of reality caused by death occurring under specific circumstances. Violent death combined with profound despair, usually. A soul torn from its body while still bound to earth by love or rage or unfinished business. Dracula knew this already, had lived it. His own transformation had come after a battle against the Turks, after he had been betrayed by those he trusted and left to die alone in the darkness. He had called out for Elisabeth with his last breath, had refused to accept that death would separate them, and something had answered that refusal. Not God, not the devil, but something older and more terrible, something that existed in the spaces between life and death. It had offered him a choice in that moment, to pass on and leave Elisabeth alone in a world of enemies, or to return and protect her, even if the price was his own damnation. He had chosen to return, had clawed his way back from the edge of oblivion, only to discover that the thing he had become was more threat than protector. Elisabeth had lived only 3 more years after his transformation, 3 years of him hiding what he was from her, feeding on strangers in the night while pretending to be the husband she remembered. When fever finally took her, part of him had been relieved that she would never have to know the truth of what he had become. Methodius theorized that such curses could be broken, Elena continued, but only under very specific conditions. The cursed individual must genuinely desire redemption, not for selfish reasons, but because they have remembered what it means to love selflessly. They must face every sin they have committed and accept full responsibility for each one, without excuse or justification. They must receive forgiveness from one who carries the blood of their original love, freely given without coercion. And finally, they must be willing to surrender their immortal existence, to embrace true death with all its finality and mystery. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the candlelight. My ancestor left instructions that were very clear. When the time came that a daughter of her line could speak the secret words without fear, when a vampire of sufficient age had grown weary enough of darkness to genuinely seek the light, the breaking of the curse would become possible. She believed that you would reach this point eventually, Vlad. She had faith that the man she loved was stronger than the monster he became. Dracula turned away from her, unable to bear the naked hope in her expression. He paced to one of the tall windows that overlooked the castle courtyard, staring out at the storm that still raged across the mountains. Lightning painted the clouds in shades of silver and violet, and he wondered if this was how damnation truly worked. Not through lakes of fire and torturing demons, but through the slow accumulation of losses, the gradual erosion of everything that made existence bearable, until even the curse itself became a burden too heavy to carry. 400 years, he said quietly. 400 years of hunting, of killing, of watching empires rise and fall, while I remained unchanged. Do you have any concept of how many lives I have taken in that time? I stopped counting after the 1st century because the numbers became meaningless. Merchants and beggars, priests and prostitutes, the innocent and the guilty. I drank them all down and left them as empty husks. I have destroyed families, orphaned children, widowed lovers. I have been the darkness that parents warn their children about, the monster that makes strong men barricade their doors at night. How can forgiveness be offered for such an ocean of blood? Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. Forgiveness is not about deserving it, Vlad. It is about accepting that carrying the weight of all those deaths will not bring a single victim back. It is about choosing to stop adding to the darkness. Elisabeth knew what you would become, knew the curse would twist you into something terrible, but she never stopped believing that the core of who you were could survive even that. She left these instructions for my family because she trusted that when the time came, you would be ready to lay down your burden. He turned to face her again, and this time he let his true nature show fully. His eyes blazed with the crimson light that marked his kind. His lips pulled back to reveal fangs that had torn countless throats, and shadows seemed to gather around him like living things. I am not some tragic hero waiting for salvation, he snarled. I am a killer and a monster. I have enjoyed the hunt, savored the terror in my victims' eyes. For every moment of guilt or regret, there have been 10 moments of savage satisfaction. Do not stand there and paint me as some tormented soul yearning for redemption. I chose this existence. I chose it every single night for 4 centuries. Elena did not retreat, did not show fear. Instead, she stepped closer to him, close enough that he could hear her heartbeat, smell the warmth of her blood beneath her skin. That makes the choice even more important, she said. You are not being offered redemption because you deserve it or because you have suffered enough to earn it. You are being offered a choice, the same choice everyone faces, to continue as you are or to change, to embrace darkness or to reach for light. Elisabeth believed you could make that choice, but she also knew it had to be yours freely made. I cannot force you to seek redemption. I can only offer you the path and trust that the man Elisabeth loved is still somewhere inside you, buried beneath centuries of death, but not destroyed. The storm outside reached a crescendo, thunder shaking the ancient stones of the castle. In the great hall below, Dracula could hear the mortal guests growing nervous, their conversations turning to worried murmurs about the weather and whether they should brave the roads or beg shelter for the night. His servants would accommodate them, of course, would provide beds and blankets and ensure their safety. That was part of the deception, the careful maintenance of the illusion that this was merely the home of an eccentric nobleman rather than a predator's lair. How would it work, he heard himself ask, and was surprised by his own words. If I were to attempt this breaking of the curse, what would be required of me? Eleanor returned to the book, running her fingers over the ancient text. The ritual takes 3 nights, she said. The first night is for remembrance. You must revisit every significant life you have taken, not just acknowledge them, but truly remember them as individuals. Their names, if you knew them, their faces, their final moments. You must confront what your hunger has cost the world and accept that weight fully. The second night is for confession. You must speak aloud every sin, every cruelty, every moment when you chose darkness over light. This is not for my judgment, but for your own, to face yourself without the lies or justifications that let us live with what we have done. The third night is for forgiveness. I will offer you absolution in Elisabeth's name, and you must accept it not just intellectually but in your heart. Then, as dawn breaks on the 3rd day, you must walk into the sunlight with faith that you will die as a man rather than burn as a monster. Walk into sunlight. The word sent a primal shudder through him. Sunlight was the ultimate destruction for his kind, instant and absolute. A vampire caught in daylight did not merely die but was annihilated, reduced to ash and scattered on the wind. The thought of deliberately walking into that obliteration went against every survival instinct that had kept him alive for centuries. And if the ritual fails? He asked. If I complete all these steps and the curse remains unbroken? What then? Then you will burn, Elena said simply, and you will die knowing you tried, which is perhaps better than living forever, knowing you were too afraid to reach for redemption. The brutal honesty of her answer struck him more powerfully than any attempt at reassurance could have. She was not promising him safety or certainty, was not trying to seduce him with comfortable lies. She was offering him a chance and acknowledging that the price of failure was total destruction. There was something almost noble in that stark truth. He moved to the reading table and looked down at the book, at the intricate diagrams and dense script that promised either salvation or annihilation. His mind raced through possibilities, searching for hidden traps or overlooked consequences. If this was truly a plot by vampire hunters to destroy him, it was remarkably elaborate. But then again, he was old and powerful enough that conventional methods had long since ceased to pose a threat. Perhaps this was the only way they could hope to eliminate him, by convincing him to destroy himself. Yet as he studied Elena's face, saw the tears that still glistened on her cheeks, and the trembling of her hands as she held Elisabeth's locket, he found it hard to believe this was deception. She believed what she was saying, that much was clear. Whether she was right or tragically mistaken remained to be seen. "I need time to consider this," he said finally. "This is not a decision to be made rashly. I have existed as I am for 400 years. Another few days to contemplate the end of that existence seems reasonable." Elena nodded. "I understand, but I must warn you that the ritual can only be performed during a specific astronomical configuration. The old texts are clear on this point. The 3 nights must begin when the moon is dark and Mars rises in the house of Scorpio. Such alignments are rare. The next one begins tomorrow night, and there will not be another for 7 years. Tomorrow night. The words hung in the air like a sentence of execution. Dracula had imagined he would have weeks or months to wrestle with this decision, to examine it from every angle, to prepare himself mentally for the ordeal, or to ultimately reject it. Instead, he had less than a day to choose between eternal damnation and probable destruction. "Why did you not come sooner?" he demanded, anger rising in his voice. "Why wait until the last possible moment to present me with this impossible choice?" "I came as soon as I could," Elena replied, her own voice rising to match his intensity. "Do you think it was easy to get here? To convince my family that I should be the one to make this journey? To gather the courage to walk into the castle of Count Dracula, knowing that I might not walk out again? I have been preparing for this my entire life, studying the texts, learning the Latin, training myself to face you without fear. But I am still only human, still only one woman standing before a creature of legend. I came when I was ready, which happened to be now. If that is not soon enough for you, then I apologize, but I cannot change the movement of the stars." Her words struck him with unexpected force. He had been so focused on his own dilemma, his own fear and uncertainty, that he had not fully considered what this journey must have cost her. She had walked alone into the lair of a vampire, carrying nothing but ancient books and older faith, trusting that some remnant of the man Elisabeth had loved still existed after 4 centuries of darkness. That took a courage he could barely comprehend, a strength of spirit that made his own hesitation seem cowardly in comparison. The storm outside began to subside, thunder rolling away toward the distant peaks. In the silence that followed, Dracula became aware of other sounds. The guests in the great hall were settling down for the night, his servants providing them with rooms in the western wing. Soon the castle would be quiet except for the eternal stillness that he had learned to associate with the hours before dawn. Time was passing, carrying him toward a decision he was not sure he could make. "Tell me about Elisabeth's last days," he said suddenly. "The fever took her quickly, and I was not permitted to be near her for fear I would catch it myself. Our physicians insisted on quarantine. I listened from outside her door as she weakened and died, and it was the single greatest torture of my mortal life. What did she say before the end? What were her final thoughts?" Elena's expression softened. "My family has preserved her last letter, written when she knew the fever would kill her. She could barely hold the pen, but she insisted on writing it herself. She addressed it to her sister, my ancestor, and she included instructions for what we have been discussing. But she also wrote of you, Vlad. She said that loving you was the greatest joy of her life, and that if there was any justice in heaven, she would find a way to help you even after death. She said that the curse was not your fault, that you had been trapped by circumstances beyond your control, and that she forgave you for everything that came after. She made my ancestor swear on the cross that her family would watch over you from a distance, generation after generation, until the day came when redemption might be possible. Dracula felt something break inside him, some final barrier that had been holding back an ocean of grief. He had told himself for 400 years that Elisabeth had died hating him, that she had seen what he was becoming and been repulsed by it. He had used that imagined rejection as justification for every dark deed, had told himself that if she had not loved him, then nothing mattered and he might as well embrace the monster fully. To learn now that she had forgiven him, that she had loved him until the very end and beyond, was almost more than he could bear. He turned away from Eleanor, not wanting her to see the tears that suddenly blurred his vision. Vampires could not weep. Their bodies no longer produced the fluids necessary for such human expressions, but in that moment he felt something close to it, a wrenching sensation in his chest that might have been his long-dead heart trying to remember how to break. "I am afraid," he whispered, the words torn from him against his will. "I am afraid that I will complete the ritual and it will not work. I am afraid that I will burn in the sunlight and discover that there is something worse than this existence waiting beyond death. I am afraid that even if the curse is broken, I will be barred from any rest, that hell has been saving a special place for me all these centuries. Most of all, I'm afraid that Elisabeth's faith in me was misplaced, that whatever she loved in me died long before she did." Eleanor crossed the distance between them and did something that shocked him into stillness. She took his hand, her warm, living fingers wrapping around his cold, dead ones, and held on despite the unnatural chill of his skin. "I cannot promise you that your fears are unfounded," she said quietly. "I cannot guarantee that everything will work as the texts describe, but I can tell you that doing nothing, continuing as you are, guarantees that you will never know. Elisabeth believed in you, Vlad. She believed in you when you were a mortal man struggling to protect your people, and she believed in you when the curse transformed you into something dark. Her faith has been passed down through 10 generations of my family, and it has brought me to this moment. Perhaps that faith is worth more than your fear." Dracula looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between her living warmth and his deathly cold. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with tenderness rather than terror. The sensation was almost painful in its intimacy, a reminder of what he had lost and what he might reclaim if he was brave enough to try. "Very well," he said, the words feeling like stepping off a cliff into unknown darkness. "I will attempt the ritual. Tomorrow night, when the stars align and the moon is dark, I will begin the work of remembering my victims and confronting my sins. But I make no promises that I will complete all 3 nights. If at any point this proves to be a trap or a trick, if I sense deception or danger, I will end this immediately, and you will face the consequences of having misled me." Elena squeezed his hand once before releasing it. "I would expect nothing less. I am not asking for blind trust, only for the willingness to try. Tomorrow night, then. We will begin the journey toward redemption or destruction, whichever awaits you at the end." She gathered up the ancient book and Elisabeth's locket, preparing to leave the library. Dracula watched her, this brave mortal woman who had walked into darkness carrying nothing but hope and old promises. As she reached the door, he called out to her, "Elena, where will you stay tonight? The storm has passed, but the roads will be treacherous." "You should not attempt to leave until morning." She turned back to him with the faintest suggestion of a smile. "I had assumed I would stay here in the castle. If I am to guide you through the ritual, I should remain close. Unless you fear for my safety in your home." He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. She should absolutely fear for her safety in his home. Every instinct of his predatory nature screamed at him to drain her, to end this threat before it could develop further, to eliminate the possibility of change before it could take root. But stronger than those instincts was something else, something that might have been hope or might simply have been exhaustion from carrying his burden alone for so long. "You may stay," he said. "I will instruct my servants to prepare a room for you in the southern tower. It has a lock on the door, and I give you my word that no harm will come to you under my roof. Not tonight, and not for as long as you remain here in good faith." She nodded, accepting his promise. "Then I will see you tomorrow night when the work begins. Until then, I suggest you prepare yourself as best you can. What lies ahead will not be easy." She left then, her footsteps fading into the distance. Dracula remained in the library, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, staring at the place where she had stood. The candles burned lower, shadows growing longer, and outside the first light of false dawn began to touch the eastern horizon. He would need to retreat to his resting place soon, to escape the deadly light that would reduce him to ash. But before he did, he walked to the window and looked out at the mountains he had called home for so long. Tomorrow night would mark the beginning of either his redemption or his final destruction. After 400 years of unchanging darkness, he would finally face the possibility of transformation. He was not sure if he felt more terror or relief. The following night came with unnatural stillness. No wind stirred the ancient trees that surrounded Castle Dracula, no clouds marred the black velvet of the sky, and the stars burned with cold brilliance above the mountains. The moon was indeed dark, a shadow against the heavens, and somewhere in the eastern sky, Mars glowed like a drop of blood. The astronomical alignment was perfect, just as the ancient texts had promised. It was a night for endings or beginnings, for transformation or destruction. Dracula had not rested well during the day. His sleeping place, a sealed chamber deep beneath the castle where no light could penetrate, had felt more like a tomb than ever before. He had lain in the darkness listening to the silence, thinking about what awaited him when night fell again. The ritual of remembrance, the confrontation with 400 years of victims, the weight of every life he had taken pressing down upon whatever remained of his conscience. He had tried to tell himself during those dark hours that he could not remember them all, that the sheer number made individual recollection impossible. But that was a lie he had told himself for centuries, and he knew it now for what it was. He remembered every single one. Their faces were carved into his memory with perfect clarity, because vampires forgot nothing. The curse that gave him immortality also gave him perfect recall, an endless repository of moments that could never fade or blur with time. Every scream, every plea, every final breath was preserved in crystalline detail within his mind. When night finally fell and he rose from his rest, he found Elena waiting for him in the library. She had transformed the space, moving aside the heavy reading table and arranging candles in a specific pattern on the floor. They formed a circle perhaps 10 feet in diameter, with symbols drawn between them in what looked like salt mixed with ash. At the center of the circle sat 2 chairs facing each other, simple wooden seats that looked impossibly fragile in the vast room. She had changed her traveling dress for something more formal, a gown of deep black that would have been appropriate for mourning. Her hair was unbound now, falling in waves past her shoulders, and she wore Elisabeth's locket openly around her neck. In her hands she held the ancient book, open to pages covered in ritual instructions. "You came," she said, and he heard both surprise and relief in her voice. "I was not certain you would." "I gave you my word," Dracula replied, though even he was not entirely sure what had driven him to honor that promise. He had broken countless oaths over the centuries, had learned that words meant nothing when survival was at stake. Yet something about this felt different, felt binding in a way that transcended mere verbal agreement. Eleanor gestured to the circle of candles. "The ritual must be performed within the sacred space. No harm can come to either of us while we remain inside it. But we also cannot leave until the work of the night is complete. Once we begin, we must continue until dawn, no matter how difficult it becomes. Do you understand?" He understood. This was a prison as much as a protection, a commitment that could not be broken once undertaken. He looked at the candles, at the symbols drawn in salt and ash, and recognized some of them from his studies. Protection wards, binding sigils, markers of sacred ground. If he stepped into that circle, he would be subjecting himself to forces he had spent centuries avoiding. Elena seemed to sense his hesitation. "I will be with you through all of it," she said. "You will not face this alone. Whatever you remember, whatever pain you must confront, I will bear witness. That is part of the ritual. You must speak your memories aloud, must share the burden with one who can hear without judgment." Without judgment. The words seemed almost cruel in their impossibility. How could anyone hear what he had done without judgment? How could any moral creature listen to 400 years of murder and remain neutral. But he looked at Elena's face, at the compassion in her dark eyes, and he understood. She was not promising to approve of his actions or to excuse them. She was promising to listen, to acknowledge, to be present while he confronted what he had become. He stepped into the circle. The moment his foot crossed the boundary of candles, he felt something change in the air. A pressure descended upon him, not painful but unmistakable, as if invisible hands were pressing down on his shoulders. The protection wards hummed with power, recognizing what he was and holding him in place through sheer spiritual force. He could no more leave this circle now than he could walk in sunlight. Elena entered behind him and sat in one of the chairs. She gestured for him to take the other, and after a moment's hesitation, he complied. They sat facing each other with perhaps 3 feet between them, close enough that he could see every detail of her expression, could hear the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. She opened the book and began to read in Latin, her voice low and steady. The words were a prayer or perhaps an invocation, calling upon powers that Dracula had long since turned away from. He felt those powers gathering in response, felt the weight of divine attention focusing on this small circle of candlelight in the depths of his dark castle. It should have burned him, that attention, should have seared his corrupted flesh like holy water, but instead it simply held him firm and inexorable, waiting. When the prayer ended, Elena looked up at him. "The text says you must begin with the first," she said. "The first life you took after the transformation. Speak their name if you knew it, describe their face, and tell the truth of how they died. The first." Dracula closed his eyes, though he did not need to. The memory was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. His first victim, the one who had died before he even understood what he had become. "His name was Piotr," Dracula said, his voice rough. "He was a stable boy in my own household, perhaps 16 years old. Brown hair, blue eyes, a gap between his front teeth. He loved horses and had a gift for calming even the most fractious animals. He was loyal and honest, and he died because I could not control the hunger." He opened his eyes and saw Elena watching him, her expression calm and attentive. He forced himself to continue. "It was 3 days after my transformation. I had hidden what I was from everyone, had locked myself in my chambers and refused all visitors. But the hunger grew until it was like fire in my veins, until I could think of nothing else. I heard Piotr outside my door, bringing food that I had no need of anymore. I called him in. He came willingly, worried about me, asking if I was unwell. I fell upon him like a beast. I tore his throat open and drank until there was nothing left, until his heart stopped beating beneath my hands. When I finally realized what I had done, I was kneeling in a pool of his blood, and his dead eyes were staring at me with eternal accusation. The words hung in the air between them. Dracula waited for Elena to recoil, to show horror or disgust, but she simply nodded and made a small mark in the book. "Continue," she said. "Tell me about the next one." And so he did. One by one he called forth the memories he had tried to bury beneath centuries of rationalization and forced forgetfulness. He spoke of the serving girl who had reminded him too much of Elisabeth, whose blood had tasted of innocence, and whose last words had been a prayer for mercy. He spoke of the traveling merchant whose only crime had been to seek shelter on a rainy night, who had left behind a wife and 3 children. He spoke of the priest who had come to the castle armed with crosses and holy water, thinking to save souls, who had learned too late that faith alone was not enough against a creature of such ancient evil. The memories came faster as the night progressed, a terrible cascade of faces and names and final moments. Some victims he had known well, servants who had trusted him or nobles who had considered him a friend. Others had been strangers, people whose paths had crossed his purely by chance, who had died simply because they were in the wrong place when his hunger grew too strong. He had killed soldiers and scholars, prostitutes and mothers, the guilty and the innocent alike. He had killed out of hunger, out of anger, out of boredom. He had killed quickly and he had killed slowly. He had killed with regret and he had killed with savage pleasure. Eleanor listened to it all without speaking, without interrupting, her face a mask of compassion that never wavered. Occasionally she would make a mark in the book, keeping count perhaps, or noting significant details, but mostly she simply sat and bore witness, her presence a quiet anchor as he drowned in the ocean of his own crimes. Hours passed, the candles burned lower, their flames never wavering despite the passage of time. Dracula's voice grew hoarse from speaking, from forcing out words that scraped his throat like broken glass. But he could not stop, could not pause, because the ritual held him in its grip and demanded completion. The pressure on his shoulders grew heavier with each confession, as if he was literally carrying the weight of all those deaths. Some memories were worse than others. There was the young mother he had killed while her infant slept in the next room, too young to understand why Mama would not wake up. There was the old scholar who had figured out what he was, and had begged not for his own life but for Dracula to spare his grandchildren. There was the couple who had died together, the man throwing himself at Dracula in a futile attempt to save his lover, both of them ending up drained and discarded in a ditch by the roadside. And then there were the children. Dracula had tried to tell himself over the years that he avoided children, that he drew some line there, maintained some fragment of moral restraint, but the memories proved that lie. Not many, perhaps, but more than none. Runaways and orphans, children who would not be missed, whose blood sang with a sweetness that adult blood lacked. He forced himself to speak their names, to describe their faces, to acknowledge what their loss had meant to a world that hardly noticed they had gone. By the time he reached the 100th victim, Dracula was shaking. Not from physical weakness, vampires did not tire in that way, but from the sheer emotional toll of confronting what he had done. He had thought himself beyond such feelings, had believed that centuries of killing had numbed him to guilt or shame. But the ritual was stripping away every defense, every rationalization, leaving him naked before the magnitude of his crimes. Elena finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "We are perhaps a quarter of the way through the night," she said. "You have spoken of 100 deaths. How many more remain?" "Too many," Dracula whispered. "God help me, there are too many." "Then we continue," Elena said. "Speak the next name." And he did. On and on through the dark hours, an endless litany of death. He spoke of killing entire families to preserve his secret, of draining travelers and leaving their bodies for wolves, of using his powers of hypnotic suggestion to lure victims to their doom. He spoke of the times he had killed out of genuine necessity, when exposure would have meant destruction, and the far more numerous times he had killed simply because he could, because he was powerful and they were weak, and the hunger whispered that they existed only to feed him. Somewhere around the 200th victim, he began to notice patterns in his own behavior, how he had rationalized each killing at the time, telling himself that this person was wicked or that person would not be missed, or this death was somehow necessary, how those rationalizations had grown thinner over time until he had stopped bothering with them altogether, how in the early decades he had felt guilt after each kill, but gradually that guilt had faded until killing became as thoughtless as breathing had once been. Eleanor asked him questions occasionally, drawing out details he tried to skip over. "Did you know their family situation? Did they beg for mercy? Did you feel anything as they died?" Her questions were not accusatory but clinical, forcing him to examine each death fully, rather than simply listing names. The effect was devastating. He could not hide behind generalities or bury individual tragedies in the mass of numbers. Each victim became real again, a unique person whose life he had stolen, whose potential he had destroyed. The 300th victim had been a young woman who reminded him painfully of Elena herself. Dark eyes, chestnut hair, that same mixture of intelligence and compassion. He had seen her in a village tavern and had been transfixed by her resemblance to Elisabeth. He had followed her home, had broken into her room while she slept, intending merely to watch her breathe. But the hunger had overcome his restraint, as it always did, and he had killed her in her own bed. He had stayed until dawn, forced him to flee, sitting beside her corpse and weeping tearless tears, knowing that he had destroyed yet another echo of what he had lost. As he described this killing to Elena, his voice finally broke. "I am a monster," he said. The words ripped from somewhere deep inside him. "I have always been a monster. Elisabeth was wrong to believe I could be saved. There is nothing here worth saving, nothing but rot and death and an endless appetite for destruction." Elena reached across the space between them and took his hand again, just as she had the night before. Her touch was warm and alive, and entirely unafraid. "You are not just a monster," she said quietly. "A monster would not feel what you are feeling right now. A monster would not remember these victims as individuals or mourn what their deaths meant. You have done monstrous things, yes. You have killed and destroyed and caused immeasurable suffering, but you are also sitting here confronting all of it, forcing yourself to remember when it would be easier to forget. That takes courage that no mere monster possesses." Her words should have been comfort, but they felt like knives. He did not want courage, did not want to be told he was anything other than the pure evil he knew himself to be. It would be easier if he could fully embrace damnation, could reject this attempt at redemption, and return to the simplicity of being solely a predator. But Elena's hand in his kept him anchored, kept him from fleeing into the comfortable darkness of self-hatred. "Continue," she said. "There are more to remember before the night ends." He continued, the 400, the 5th, each victim pulling him deeper into the abyss of his own making. He spoke of wars he had witnessed, of plagues he had survived by feeding on the dying, of social upheavals that had provided him with chaos enough to hunt freely. He spoke of the decades when he had tried to be selective, taking only criminals or the terminally ill, and how those attempts at restraint had always eventually broken down. He spoke of the long periods of isolation when he had retreated from humanity entirely, hiding in his castle and sending servants to procure victims for him so he would not have to face what he was doing. As he approached the 600th victim, the candles began to gutter. Dawn was approaching. He could feel it in his bones, that primal awareness of the sun preparing to rise. Soon the deadly light would touch the mountains, and he would need to retreat to his sealed chamber or face destruction. But the ritual held him fast, would not release him until the work was complete. Elena sensed his agitation. "We have time," she said. "The night will not end until you have spoken the last name. That is part of the magic binding this space. Time flows differently here, stretched to accommodate what must be done." He did not fully understand how such a thing was possible, but he felt the truth of it. The candles should have burned out hours ago, but still they flickered steadily. Dawn should have come and gone multiple times in the hours he had been speaking, but the darkness outside the windows remained absolute. They existed in a pocket outside normal time, suspended between one breath and the next, while he paid the price for 400 years of death. The final 100 were the hardest, not because they were worse than what had come before, but because he was exhausted beyond measure. Not physically, but spiritually, emotionally, his very soul scraped raw by the relentless confrontation with his crimes. But he forced himself onward, speaking each name, describing each face, acknowledging each stolen life. The last victim he spoke of was the most recent, a traveling scholar he had killed only a month before. An old man seeking knowledge in ancient libraries, who had arrived at the castle with letters of introduction and a naive belief that Count Dracula was merely an eccentric noble who collected rare books. Dracula had entertained him for 3 days, had engaged in fascinating conversations about history and philosophy, had genuinely enjoyed the man's company. Then, on the 3rd night, he had killed him anyway, because that was what he did. Because the hunger demanded feeding, and the scholar was convenient and there would be no consequences. That was the 739th victim. Dracula said, his voice barely a whisper. "There were others whose names I never learned, faces glimpsed for only a moment before I killed them. Beggars and vagrants, people so far outside society that no one noted their passing. Perhaps another 100 or more. I cannot say with certainty because I did not value them enough to remember them properly." Elena made a final mark in the book and closed it gently. 800 or more lives, she said, 8 centuries of death compressed into 4 centuries of existence. The weight of that is almost incomprehensible. Dracula sat slumped in his chair, feeling crushed beneath that weight. He had known intellectually how many people he had killed, had done the mathematics during long nights of self-examination. But speaking each one aloud, remembering them as individuals rather than numbers, had transformed abstract knowledge into visceral reality. He was not just a killer. He was a force of destruction, a walking catastrophe that had left an ocean of grief in his wake. "How can I be forgiven for this?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. "How can any power in existence look at what I have done and decide that redemption is possible? I have destroyed worlds, Elena. Every person I killed was the center of someone else's universe. Children lost parents, parents lost children, lovers were separated, friends were left to mourn. The ripples of my actions have spread across centuries, touching thousands of lives I never even saw. How does one atone for such totality of harm?" Elena was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with emotion. "You cannot atone for it," she said. "Not fully, not in any way that balances the scales. The people you killed are gone forever, and nothing you do can bring them back. Their loss is permanent, and your guilt is real. But forgiveness is not about balancing scales or erasing harm. It is about acknowledging that you cannot change the past and choosing instead to change the future. It is about accepting that you are more than the sum of your worst actions, even when those actions are monstrous." She opened the book again to a different page. "The ritual of remembrance is complete," she said. "You have faced what you did and spoken the truth aloud without excuse or justification. That was the first step. Tomorrow night you will face the second step, speaking your sins aloud and accepting responsibility for them. But for now, you have done enough. The circle will release you and you may rest." As she spoke, Dracula felt the pressure on his shoulders begin to lift. The invisible force that had held him in place loosened its grip, and he realized he could move freely again. The candles burned brighter for a moment, then began to dim as normal time reasserted itself. He could feel dawn approaching for real now, the sun preparing to rise beyond the mountains. He stood on unsteady legs, feeling more exhausted than he had ever felt in his long existence. Elena stood as well, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the circle. He saw tears on her face again, and realized she was crying for him, for the victims he had named, for the weight of suffering that had been laid bare in this room. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. "Thank you for bearing witness. I do not know if I can complete the next 2 nights. But I am grateful that I did not have to face this one alone." Elena reached out and touched his face, her hand gentle against his cold skin. "You are stronger than you believe, Vlad. Tonight proved that. Rest now, and when night falls again, we will continue the work." She stepped out of the circle and left the library, carrying the heavy book with her. Dracula remained for a moment longer, standing in the center of the salt and ash symbols, surrounded by the guttering candles. He thought of 800 faces, 800 names, 800 stolen futures. The weight of them was crushing, unbearable, a burden that seemed far too heavy for one being to carry. But he was carrying it. He had spoken their names, had remembered their faces, had acknowledged their deaths. It had not destroyed him, though part of him wished it had. He was still here, still existing, still capable of feeling the full measure of his guilt. Perhaps that was what Elena meant about courage, not the absence of fear or pain, but the willingness to face them and continue anyway. He left the library as the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, descending to his sealed chamber beneath the castle. As he settled into the darkness that would hold him until night fell again, he thought about tomorrow's trial. The confession, speaking aloud not just the deaths, but the sins that had led to them, the cruelty and the selfishness, the times he had chosen darkness when he could have chosen light. If tonight had been nearly unbearable, tomorrow promised to be worse. But he had made a choice, had stepped into that circle and committed himself to this path. He would see it through to the end, whether that end was redemption or destruction. He owed that much to the 800 dead, to Elisabeth's memory, and perhaps even to himself. As sleep claimed him, his last thought was of Elena's hand in his, warm and alive and utterly fearless. If she could face the monster he was with such compassion, perhaps there was still something in him worth saving after all. The second night came too quickly. Dracula woke from his daylight rest feeling no refreshment, only a sense of dread that settled over him like a shroud. The first night had stripped away his defenses, had forced him to confront the sheer magnitude of death he had caused. But tonight would be worse. Tonight was not about counting victims, but about examining the darkness within himself that had made such killing possible. Tonight was about confession. He found Elena waiting in the library as before, the circle of candles already prepared, the salt and ash symbols freshly drawn. But this time there was something different about the arrangement. She had added a second element. A bowl of water placed at the center of the circle, its surface perfectly still and reflecting the candlelight like a mirror. Beside it lay a bundle of dried herbs that filled the air with a sharp, clean scent. "The water is consecrated," Elena explained as he entered, "blessed by a priest and mixed with salt from the Dead Sea. It will serve as a mirror for your confession, reflecting back the truth of what you say. You cannot lie within this circle tonight, Vlad. Any attempt at deception or self-justification will be immediately apparent. This night requires absolute honesty." Dracula looked at the bowl of holy water and felt a familiar pang of fear. Holy water burned his kind was one of the few weapons that could cause them genuine pain. To sit beside it for hours while confessing his sins seemed designed to torture him, to add physical suffering to the spiritual agony. Elena seemed to read his thoughts. "The water will not harm you unless you try to deceive yourself," she said. "Truth is its own protection. As long as you speak honestly, you have nothing to fear from it." He wanted to ask how she could be so certain. What ancient texts promised him safety from something that had burned him before? But he had committed to this path, had survived the first night, and turning back now would mean all that suffering had been for nothing. He stepped into the circle and took his seat, feeling the familiar pressure descend upon him as the wards activated. Eleanor sat across from him and opened the ancient book. "Tonight you must speak not of what you did, but of why you did it," she said. "The ritual calls this the confession of sins, but it is more than simple admission of wrongdoing. You must examine the darkness within yourself, the choices you made and the reasons behind them. You must face not just the monster you became, but the man who allowed that transformation to happen." Dracula felt something twist in his chest. "I did not allow it," he protested. "The curse was forced upon me. I died, betrayed and alone, and something offered me a chance to return. I did not understand what I was agreeing to until it was too late." Elena's expression was gentle but unyielding. "Did you not? When the choice was offered in that moment between death and undeath, did you truly not understand what you were becoming? Or did you choose not to look too closely, because returning to Elisabeth mattered more than the cost?" The question struck him like a physical blow, because he knew the answer. In that moment of transformation, suspended between life and death, he had felt the darkness of what was being offered. Some part of him had known that accepting would corrupt him, would turn him into something terrible, but Elisabeth had been alive and in danger, and he had convinced himself that protecting her justified any price. He had chosen to return without examining too closely what returning would mean. "I knew," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I felt the wrongness of it, felt the taint of what was being offered, but I told myself that I could control it, that my love for Elisabeth would keep me human, even if my body was not. I was arrogant enough to believe I was stronger than the curse." Eleanor made a mark in the book. "That is your first sin, then. Not the transformation itself, but the pride that made you believe you could take demonic power without being changed by it. Speak it aloud as a confession." Dracula closed his eyes. "I confess that I chose undeath out of pride, believing I could wield darkness without being corrupted by it. I thought my love was pure enough to protect me from the consequences of my choice. I was wrong." The words hung in the air, and he waited for some divine judgment, some punishment for admitting what he had hidden from himself for centuries. But nothing happened. The holy water remained calm, the candles burned steadily, and Elena simply nodded for him to continue. "What came next?" she asked. "After the transformation, after you discovered what you had become, what was your next choice?" Dracula opened his eyes and stared at the bowl of water, seeing his reflection distorted in its surface. "The next choice was to hide what I was from Elisabeth. The hunger came almost immediately, overwhelming and terrible. I knew I could not tell her what had happened, knew she would be horrified. So I lied. I pretended to still be the man she had married while I hunted at night like an animal." "Why did you not tell her the truth?" Elena pressed. "If you loved her as deeply as you claim, why not trust her with what had happened?" "Because I was a coward," Dracula said, the admission burning like acid in his throat. I feared her rejection more than I feared the damnation of my own soul. I told myself I was protecting her, but truly, I was protecting myself from having to face what I had become. I wanted her to continue loving me, continue seeing me as her noble husband, even though that man was dead and something else wore his face. Speak it as a confession. I confess that I lied to Elisabeth, to the woman I claimed to love above all others. I hid my true nature from her out of selfishness and cowardice. I robbed her of the chance to make her own choice about whether to stay with a monster or flee to safety. I valued my comfort over her autonomy. The words felt like thorns being pulled from his flesh, painful but somehow necessary. He had never before articulated the depth of his betrayal to Elisabeth, had never acknowledged that his silence had been a theft of her agency. She had lived the last 3 years of her life married to something that was no longer human, and she had never known the truth. Eleanor's voice was quiet but relentless. And when you killed for the first time, when you murdered your own servant Piotr, what was the sin in that beyond the taking of his life? Dracula thought about that night, about the hunger that had driven him from his chamber. I could have resisted, he said slowly. The hunger was terrible, yes, but I had the strength to control it, if I had truly wanted to. I called Piotr to me because some part of me wanted to surrender to the curse, wanted to stop fighting and accept what I had become. His death was not just murder but capitulation. I gave up my humanity in that moment, chose to be a monster rather than continue the struggle to remain a man. Confess it. I confess that I embraced the darkness willingly. I had the strength to resist, but chose not to. I murdered an innocent boy, not because the hunger forced me, but because surrendering to it was easier than fighting. I am guilty not just of his death, but of my own moral cowardice. The confessions came faster after that, a cascade of sins both great and small. Elena guided him through his centuries of existence with merciless precision, forcing him to examine not just his actions, but the intentions behind them. Each rationalization he had built over the years was stripped away, each comfortable lie exposed to the harsh light of truth. He confessed to the sin of pride, believing himself above human law and morality because of his power. He confessed to the sin of wrath, killing not just to feed but to punish those who offended him or threatened his secrets. He confessed to the sin of envy, resenting mortals for the lives they could live in sunlight, for the families they could build, for the simple normalcy he could never reclaim. He confessed to the sin of greed, hoarding knowledge and power while the world around him suffered, using his immortality to accumulate wealth built on blood and corruption. But perhaps the worst confession was the sin of acedia, of spiritual sloth. He admitted that after the 1st century, he had simply stopped trying to be better. The weight of guilt had become too heavy, the struggle to maintain his humanity too exhausting, and so he had surrendered to despair. He had told himself that if he was damned, then his actions no longer mattered, that one more death or one less made no difference to a soul already bound for hell. That resignation to evil had been perhaps his greatest sin, because it had absolved him of responsibility for the next 3 centuries of killing. Elena listened to it all, occasionally asking questions that forced him to dig deeper, to examine motivations he had hidden even from himself. Why had he killed the young woman who resembled Elisabeth? Not just because of hunger, but because seeing her was painful, because she reminded him of what he had lost, and destroying her had been a way of destroying that pain. Why had he been so cruel to the priest who came with crosses and holy water, not just to defend himself, but because he resented the faith he could no longer access, wanted to prove that God had abandoned him by showing that God's servants were powerless against him? Every petty cruelty, every casual evil, every moment when he had chosen the easy darkness over the difficult light, all of it was dragged into the open and examined. The bowl of holy water remained calm throughout, confirming that he was speaking truth, however painful. If he tried to soften a confession or excuse a choice, the water would ripple violently, and Elena would press harder until he found the deeper honesty beneath his defenses. Hours passed in this spiritual excavation. Dracula felt himself being turned inside out, every hidden corner of his psyche exposed and cleansed. It was agony of a kind he had never experienced before, worse than any physical torture, because it struck at the very core of who he was. He could not hide behind the excuse of the curse or the hunger. Those things had shaped his actions, yes, but he had made choices within those constraints. He had chosen cruelty over mercy, vengeance over forgiveness, isolation over connection. The curse had made him a vampire, but he had made himself a monster. At one point, deep in the night, he broke down completely. The weight of 400 years of accumulated sin, of choices that could never be unmade, and harm that could never be repaired, crushed him. He bent forward in his chair, his face in his hands, and for the first time in centuries, he wished he could weep. Vampires could not produce tears, but his body shook with the need to release the pressure of grief and guilt that threatened to tear him apart from within. Eleanor rose from her chair and knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "You are doing the work," she said softly. "This is what redemption requires. Not the absence of sin, but the full acknowledgement of it. You cannot be forgiven for what you refuse to see." "But there is too much," Dracula choked out. "Too much darkness, too many sins. How can any of this matter when the scale of what I have done is so vast? Speaking these words changes nothing. The dead remain dead. The harm remains done. I am confessing to crimes that can never be answered for." "That is true," Elena agreed. "Nothing you say tonight will undo the past. But confession is not about changing what happened. It is about changing you. Every sin you acknowledge is a chain you break, a weight you set down. You have carried all of this alone for 4 centuries, hidden it even from yourself behind walls of rationalization and denial. Speaking it aloud, facing it honestly, that is how you reclaim the part of yourself that the curse tried to destroy." Her words gave him the strength to continue. He straightened in his chair and resumed the brutal work of confession. He spoke of times he had corrupted others, using his hypnotic powers to turn good people into accomplices in his evil. He spoke of opportunities he had ignored to show mercy or restraint. He spoke of the pleasure he had taken in his victims' fear, the way their terror had fed something dark in him, beyond mere hunger for blood. He confessed to sins of omission as well as commission, the times he could have saved someone and chose not to because it was inconvenient or risky. The knowledge he could have shared that might have helped humanity, but kept secret to preserve his own advantage. The warning he could have given about dangers he perceived, but remained silent because mortal suffering meant nothing to him. As the confessions poured out, Dracula began to notice something strange. With each admission, with each honest acknowledgement of his failings and choices, he felt something shift inside him. Not absolution or forgiveness, those would come later if they came at all, but a kind of clarity. The fog of lies he had told himself for so long began to lift, and he saw himself with brutal honesty for the first time in centuries. He was not a tragic figure forced into evil by circumstance. He was not a victim of cruel fate. He was a being who had been given terrible power, and had chosen again and again to use that power in the service of darkness. But seeing that truth clearly, without the comfortable obscurity of self-deception, also meant seeing something else. If his evil had been chosen, then goodness could be chosen too. If he bore responsibility for 400 years of darkness, then he also possessed the agency to choose differently. The curse had shaped him, yes, but it had not destroyed his free will entirely. Some remnant of choice had always remained, which meant that redemption, however difficult, was not impossible. Eleanor seemed to sense this shift in him. "You are beginning to understand," she said. "The curse gave you hunger and power and immortality, but it did not take away your soul. You buried your soul beneath 4 centuries of sin, convinced yourself it was dead, but it was only sleeping. Every confession you make is like clearing away rubble from ruins. You are excavating the foundation of who you truly are beneath what you became." Dracula looked at her, this brave mortal woman who had spent 2 nights sitting with a monster and refusing to look away from his evil. "How can you bear to listen to all of this?" he asked. "How can you sit here hearing confession after confession of the most depraved acts and not be destroyed by it? How can you look at me with anything but revulsion?" "Because I see more than just the monster," Elena said simply. "I see the man who is choosing to face what he has done, who is strong enough to confess the truth even when it destroys every comfortable lie he has told himself. I see someone who has suffered for 4 centuries and is finally willing to let that suffering mean something. Yes, you have done terrible things, but you are also doing this right now, which takes a kind of courage that most people will never need to summon. Her faith in him felt like a physical presence in the circle, a warmth that pushed back against the cold darkness of his confessions. He wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that beneath the monster there was still some core of humanity worth saving. But he also knew that wanting was not enough. He had to finish the work, had to drag out every last sin and face it honestly before he could claim to have truly confessed. The final confessions were perhaps the most painful because they were the most recent. He spoke of the traveling scholar he had killed just a month ago, not because he needed to feed, his hunger had been sated, but simply because it was what he did. He had murdered a good man who had shown him nothing but intellectual companionship, because letting him leave would have required effort and risk, and a choice to value another's life above his own convenience. That casual evil, that thoughtless destruction of a life for no reason beyond habit, perhaps best exemplified what he had become. He confessed to the sin of hopelessness, of deciding decades ago that redemption was impossible and using that belief as permission to stop trying. He had told himself he was beyond salvation, and therefore his actions no longer mattered, when in truth he had simply been too afraid to hope, because hope made the pain of his existence unbearable. And finally, he confessed to the sin of self-hatred masquerading as penance. He had wallowed in guilt without ever attempting to change, had used his own suffering as proof that he was somehow paying for his crimes, when in fact his suffering had changed nothing and helped no one. He had made his guilt into a comfortable prison, a way of avoiding the harder work of actually trying to be better. When the last confession was spoken, the last sin dragged into the light and acknowledged, Dracula sat in silence for a long moment. The bowl of holy water between them remained perfectly calm, reflecting the candlelight without ripple or disturbance. He had spoken truth tonight, brutal and complete truth, and the water bore witness that no deception or self-justification had tainted his words. Elena closed the book and looked at him with an expression of profound sadness and equally profound hope. "You have done it," she said. "You have faced the darkness within yourself and called it by its true name. That is the second step. Tomorrow night will be the third and final test. I will offer you forgiveness in Elisabeth's name, and you must accept it not just with your mind but with your heart. Then, as dawn breaks, you will walk into the sunlight and discover whether the curse can truly be broken." Dracula felt exhaustion wash over him again, but this time it was different from the previous night. Before he had felt crushed and broken by the weight of his victims. Tonight he felt emptied, scoured clean, as if the confessions had burned away something rotten that had been festering inside him. The guilt remained. The knowledge of what he had done would never leave him, but somehow it felt lighter now that it had been spoken aloud and acknowledged fully. "One more night," he said, and the words were both a promise and a prayer. "One more night, and I will discover if I am brave enough to embrace death after spending 4 centuries running from it." "You are brave enough," Elena said with quiet certainty. "You have proven that already. Now you must simply trust that Elisabeth's faith in you was not misplaced." As she rose to leave the circle, Dracula reached out and caught her hand. "Elena, wait. I need you to understand something. If tomorrow fails, if I burn in the sunlight and there is no redemption waiting beyond death, I want you to know that these 3 nights have meant something to me. For 400 years I have been alone with my darkness. You have given me the gift of witness of someone who sees what I am and does not turn away. Whatever comes tomorrow, thank you for that." Elena squeezed his hand gently. "You will not face tomorrow alone either, Vlad. I will be there with you until the very end, whether that end is death or transformation. That is my promise to you and to Elisabeth's memory." She left then, and Dracula remained in the circle as dawn approached. Tomorrow night would be the final trial. Forgiveness, acceptance, and then the ultimate test of walking into sunlight that had meant instant death for 4 centuries. He should have been terrified, and part of him was. But another part, a part he had thought long dead, felt something that might have been anticipation. For 400 years he had existed in darkness. Tomorrow, one way or another, that existence would end. Either he would burn and finally know peace, or he would walk into sunlight as a man and discover that redemption was real. Either way, the long night was finally coming to its close. And despite everything, despite all the fear and pain and uncertainty, that felt like a mercy. The third night began differently from the others. When Dracula entered the library as darkness fell, he found that Elena had transformed the space completely. The circle of candles remained, but now they numbered 40 in total, their arrangement forming an intricate pattern that seemed to pulse with light. Fresh flowers had been placed at intervals between the candles, white roses that filled the air with their sweet scent. The salt and ash symbols had been redrawn with meticulous care, and at the center of the circle, instead of a bowl of water or the simple chairs from previous nights, there stood a small altar draped in white cloth. On the altar lay 3 objects: Elisabeth's locket, open to show the faded portrait, the ancient iron key that had unlocked the library door, and a letter yellowed with age, sealed with red wax that bore the imprint of a rose. Eleanor stood beside the altar, wearing a gown of pure white, her hair unbound and crowned with a circlet of the same white roses that decorated the circle. In the candlelight, she looked almost ethereal, and Dracula felt his breath catch at the sight of her. "Tonight is different from the others," Elena said as he approached. "Tonight is not about pain or punishment or even acknowledgement. Tonight is about grace. You have remembered your victims and confessed your sins. Now you must do the hardest thing of all. You must accept that forgiveness is possible, even for someone who has done what you have done." Dracula stepped into the circle and felt the familiar pressure descend, but this time it was different. Where before the wards had felt constraining, almost oppressive, tonight they felt almost gentle, protective rather than punishing. He moved to stand before the altar, and Elena took her place across from him. "That letter," he said, staring at the yellowed paper, "is that from Elisabeth?" "It is her final letter to her sister," Elena confirmed. "The one I told you about, written when she knew the fever would take her. She asked that it be given to you on the 3rd night of the ritual, if you made it this far. She wanted you to hear her words in her own hand before I offered you forgiveness in her name." Elena picked up the letter with reverent care and broke the seal. The wax crumbled, 4 centuries old, and she unfolded the paper to reveal writing in faded ink. The handwriting was shaky but still legible, the script of someone whose hand trembled with fever, but whose will remained strong. Elena began to read aloud, and Dracula closed his eyes, hearing Elisabeth's voice in the words, even though she had been dead for longer than most mortals lived. "My dearest Vlad. If you are hearing these words, then you have survived what I feared most when I left this world. You have endured centuries alone in darkness, carrying a burden that would have destroyed anyone else. I know what you became after that terrible night when you were betrayed. I knew even in my final days, though you tried so hard to hide it from me. I saw the changes in you, the way you avoided sunlight, the careful way you moved as if your body no longer quite obeyed the laws that govern mortal flesh. I knew, my love, and I was never afraid of you." Dracula's eyes opened in shock. She knew. All those years he had hidden his nature, all the elaborate deceptions, and she had seen through them from the beginning. The revelation struck him like a physical blow. Elena continued reading. "You must understand that I do not blame you for what happened. The transformation was not your choice, not truly, and what you became afterward was shaped by forces beyond your control. But I also know that you will blame yourself, that you will carry the weight of every death, every sin, every moment of darkness, as if it were yours alone to bear. That is the man you were, noble and honorable and far too willing to sacrifice yourself for those you loved. It is also the man I believe you remain, buried beneath whatever curse has claimed you. I am dying, Vlad, and I face that death without fear, because I know we will be together again. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not for a very long time, but love does not end with death. It transcends mortal boundaries and endures beyond the grave. I have instructed my sister to pass down certain knowledge through our family, information that may one day help you break free of the darkness. I do not know if it will work, do not know if the curse can truly be broken, but I have faith that it can. Faith in the power of redemption, and more importantly, faith in you. When the time comes that you stand before one of my descendants, and face the possibility of salvation, know this. I forgive you, Vlad. I forgive you for every dark deed you committed in the centuries after my death. I forgive you for the monster you became and the innocents you killed. I forgive you for surviving when I could not, for continuing to exist when I was taken from this world. Most of all, I forgive you for being human, for making mistakes and wrong choices, and allowing fear to guide you into darkness. You were never meant to be perfect, my love. You were meant to be yourself, flawed and struggling and doing the best you could with impossible circumstances. The curse made you into something terrible, but it could not destroy the essence of who you are. That man, the one I loved with my whole heart, is still inside you. I know he is, because if he was not, you would never have survived this long. A true monster feels no guilt, carries no burden, suffers no remorse. You are not a monster, Vlad. You are a good man who was forced to do terrible things. So when my descendant offers you forgiveness in my name, accept it. Not because you deserve it. That is not what forgiveness is about, but because I want you to have it. I want you to be free of the weight you have carried for so long. I want you to find peace, whether that peace comes through redemption in this world or reunion in the next. But most of all, I want you to know that you are loved, that you are still loved, and that love has the power to bridge even the chasm between life and death. Walk into the light, my darling. Do not be afraid. I will be waiting for you on the other side. Forever yours, Elisabeth. Elena's voice broke on the final words, tears streaming down her face as she carefully refolded the letter. Dracula stood frozen, his mind reeling from what he had just heard. Elisabeth had known. She had seen what he was becoming and had not feared him. She had died forgiving him before he had even fully understood what he needed forgiveness for. The love in those words, the absolute faith and compassion, was more than he could process. She knew, he whispered. All that time I was hiding from her, lying to protect her from the truth. She already knew. And she loved me anyway. She loved you because of who you were, not despite what you became, Elena said gently. She saw past the curse to the soul beneath. Now you must see it too. You must accept that you are worthy of the forgiveness she offers. But I am not worthy, Dracula protested, the words torn from him. You have heard what I did, the lives I took, the suffering I caused. How can love erase that? How can forgiveness change the reality of 800 deaths? Elena set down the letter and moved closer to him. Forgiveness does not erase anything, she said. The dead remain dead. The harm remains done. But forgiveness frees you from the obligation to carry all of that alone. It acknowledges that you have suffered, that you have changed, that you are more than the sum of your worst actions. Elisabeth offers you this gift freely, with full knowledge of what you have done. The question is whether you are brave enough to accept it. Dracula looked at the altar, at Elisabeth's locket and the key and the letter that had waited 400 years to be read. He thought about the 2 previous nights, the brutal work of remembrance and confession, the excavation of every sin, and the acknowledgement of every victim. He had done that work honestly, had faced the full measure of his darkness without flinching. Surely that should make accepting forgiveness easier. But it did not. Accepting forgiveness meant letting go of the guilt that had defined him for centuries. It meant admitting that he could be more than a monster, that redemption was real and transformation was possible. It meant hoping, and hope was the most terrifying thing of all, because hope could be destroyed and leave him with nothing. I do not know how, he admitted, his voice breaking. I do not know how to accept forgiveness. I have carried this guilt for so long that I do not know who I am without it. If I am not the monster who must be punished, if I am not the damned creature who deserves only suffering, then who am I? You are Vlad, Elena said simply. You are the man Elisabeth loved, the prince who fought to protect his people, the husband who would have given anything to save his wife. You are also the vampire who killed and destroyed and caused immeasurable suffering. You are both of those things at once, and forgiveness does not require you to pretend the darkness never existed. It only asks you to accept that the darkness is not all you are. She reached out and took both of his hands in hers, her warmth seeping into his cold flesh. I stand here as Elisabeth's descendant, carrying her blood and her will. by the authority she gave to our family, by the love she bore for you that transcends death itself, I offer you forgiveness. For every life taken, every sin committed, every choice made in darkness, I forgive you in her name. The weight you have carried is acknowledged and witnessed, and now it is released. You are forgiven, Vlad. You are free. The words hung in the air like a benediction, and Dracula felt something crack inside him. The walls he had built around his heart, the defenses that had kept him separate from his own emotions for centuries, began to crumble. Eleanor was offering him exactly what Elisabeth's letter had promised, and he wanted desperately to accept it. But accepting meant facing the full measure of what he had lost, what he had destroyed, what he could never reclaim. It meant grief on a scale that threatened to annihilate him. I killed them, he choked out. 800 people, Elena. I ended their lives and destroyed their futures. How can I be forgiven for that? How can any force in the universe look at what I have done and declare it forgiven? Because forgiveness is not about what you deserve, Elena said, her voice fierce with conviction. It is about grace. It is about the possibility of transformation, even after terrible harm. It is about acknowledging that you are more than your worst moment, more than your darkest actions. Yes, you killed 800 people. Yes, you caused immeasurable suffering. But you also spent 2 nights facing every one of those deaths and every one of those sins without excuse or justification. You also chose to seek redemption, even though it might destroy you. That choice matters, Vlad. That choice means something. Dracula felt tears he could not shed burning in his eyes. For 400 years he had carried his guilt alone, had convinced himself that he was beyond salvation and unworthy of mercy. But Elena stood before him, offering exactly what he had thought impossible, and something in him broke open at the gift of it. Not the curse, not yet, but something deeper. The rigid certainty that he was irredeemable, that transformation was beyond his reach, shattered like glass. I accept, he whispered, the words barely audible. I accept your forgiveness. I accept Elisabeth's love. I accept that I can be more than the monster I became. The moment the words left his lips, something changed in the circle. The candles flared brighter, their flames dancing upward in perfect unison. The white roses released their scent in a wave of sweetness that filled the library, and Dracula felt something shift inside him, deep in the place where the curse had taken root centuries ago. It was not gone, not yet, but it had loosened its grip. A crack had appeared in the foundation of his damnation. Elena stepped forward and embraced him, her arms wrapping around him in a gesture of pure compassion. Dracula stood rigid for a moment, unused to being touched with tenderness. Then slowly he returned the embrace. She was warm and alive and utterly fearless, and holding her felt like holding a piece of the humanity he had thought lost forever. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for bringing me her words. Thank you for offering me what I thought impossible. Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving." Elena pulled back to look at him, tears still streaming down her face. "The work is not finished," she said. "You have accepted forgiveness, but now comes the final test. When dawn breaks, you must walk into the sunlight. The curse will either break, and you will die as a man, or it will hold, and you will burn as a vampire. There is no certainty, Vlad, only faith." Dracula nodded, feeling strangely calm now that the moment had arrived. For 400 years, he had feared the sun, had structured his entire existence around avoiding its deadly light. But now, with forgiveness accepted and the possibility of redemption real, he found he was not afraid. Or perhaps he was afraid but willing to face that fear, which was its own kind of courage. "How long until dawn?" he asked. "An hour, perhaps less," Elena replied. "We should prepare." She led him from the library to the eastern tower, the highest point in the castle. A narrow stairway spiraled upward, and they climbed in silence, the only sound their footsteps echoing off the stone. When they reached the top, they emerged onto a small platform open to the sky. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and to the east, the faintest suggestion of light touched the horizon. Dracula walked to the eastern edge of the platform and looked out over his domain. The forests and mountains that had been his hunting ground for centuries stretched away into darkness. He could see the villages where he had taken victims, the roads where travelers had met their doom, the wilderness where he had hidden from humanity. This land was soaked in blood he had spilled, haunted by ghosts he had created. If the ritual worked and he died, perhaps those ghosts could finally rest. Eleanor stood beside him, and together they waited for the dawn. The sky began to lighten slowly, darkness giving way to deep blue, then violet, then the first hint of gold. Dracula felt the familiar dread rising, the primal panic that every vampire felt at the approach of daylight. His body screamed at him to flee, to run back to the safety of his sealed chamber, to hide from the light that meant annihilation. But he did not run. He stood firm, drawing strength from Elena's presence beside him, from Elisabeth's words still ringing in his memory, from the forgiveness he had accepted, and the work he had done over 3 terrible nights. If he was to die, he would die facing the light rather than cowering in darkness. That much, at least, he owed to the man he had once been. The sun rose with agonizing slowness, its light spreading across the mountains like liquid gold. Dracula felt the first rays touch his skin and braced for the burning, for the instant immolation that had been his fate for 4 centuries. But the burning did not come. Instead, he felt warmth, real warmth, not the cold mockery of temperature he had experienced as a vampire, but genuine heat soaking into his flesh. He looked down at his hand where the sunlight touched it and saw something impossible. His skin, which had been pale as death for 400 years, was darkening. Not burning, not turning to ash, but taking on color. The blue veins became visible beneath the surface, and as he watched, a faint flush of pink appeared. Blood, real blood, flowing through living flesh. "It is working," Eleanor breathed beside him, her voice filled with wonder. "Vlad, the curse is breaking." Dracula could feel it happening inside him, a transformation as profound as the one that had made him a vampire, but moving in the opposite direction. The hunger that had gnawed at him for centuries suddenly vanished, replaced by sensations he had almost forgotten. True hunger for food, real thirst for water, the gentle ache of muscles that grew tired and lungs that needed to breathe. His heart, that organ which had been still for so long, began to beat. Slowly at first, uncertain, then stronger and more regular. The sound of it filled his ears, a rhythm he had not heard since his mortal life. The sun continued to rise, and more of its light spilled across the platform. Dracula stepped fully into it, spreading his arms wide, tilting his face up to receive its blessing. The warmth was incredible, almost painful after centuries of cold. He felt tears on his face, real tears produced by working glands, and he realized he was weeping. Not from pain or fear, but from joy, from the overwhelming relief of feeling human again after 400 years of undeath. But with the return of humanity came something else, pain, real physical pain as his body completed its transformation. His bones ached as they shifted from supernatural strength back to mortal fragility. His muscles cramped and spasmed. His heart, unused to beating, stuttered and raced. He fell to his knees, gasping, and Elena was there immediately, supporting him. "The transformation is hard on the body," she said, her hands steady on his shoulders. "You are becoming mortal again after 4 centuries. Your body must remember how to be alive." Dracula gripped her arms, anchoring himself against the pain. He could feel his power draining away, all the supernatural abilities that had made him a creature of legend, evaporating like morning mist. His enhanced strength faded. His unnatural speed vanished, his immortality dissolved. He was becoming fragile again, vulnerable, mortal. And it was the most beautiful agony he had ever experienced. The transformation seemed to take hours, though it was probably only minutes. When it finally completed, Dracula collapsed fully onto the stone platform, his breathing ragged, his heart pounding, every nerve in his body alight with sensation. Elena knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap, and he looked up at her through vision that was blurry with tears. "Is it done?" he asked. "Am I truly human again?" "You are," Elena confirmed, her own tears falling to mingle with his. "The curse is broken, Vlad. You are free." Dracula closed his eyes and felt the sun on his face, felt his heart beating in his chest, felt the simple miracle of being alive. For 400 years he had existed in darkness, had been neither fully alive nor fully dead. Now in these final moments he was experiencing life again with all its fragility and wonder. But even as joy filled him, he felt something else. His body, which had been sustained by supernatural forces for so long, was failing. The transformation had taken too much from him, had pushed mortal flesh beyond its limits. His heart, so recently restarted, was struggling. His breathing grew labored. He could feel himself dying, truly dying this time, and he knew there would be no resurrection, no curse to pull him back from the edge. "Elena," he whispered, his voice weak, "I am dying. The transformation broke the curse, but my body cannot sustain it. I am going to die." She nodded, tears streaming freely down her face. "I know. The ritual warned of this possibility. Your body has been undead for too long. Becoming mortal again is too great a shock. But you are dying as a man, Vlad. You are dying in sunlight, forgiven and redeemed. That is what Elisabeth promised you." Dracula reached up with a trembling hand and touched Elena's face. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for giving me this gift. Thank you for bringing me back to myself, even if only for these final moments. Tell Elisabeth," he paused, struggling for breath, "tell her I kept my promise. I found my way back to the light." "I will tell her," Elena promised. "When my own time comes and I join her in whatever lies beyond, I will tell her that you were brave until the end, that you faced your darkness and emerged victorious, that you died loved and forgiven." Dracula felt his vision beginning to dim, not with the supernatural darkness of his vampire existence, but with the natural fading of a life reaching its end. He could feel his heartbeat slowing, each beat more labored than the last, but he was not afraid. After 400 years of fearing death, of clinging desperately to existence no matter how cursed, he was finally ready to let go. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth enveloping him completely. And in that warmth, Dracula felt something extraordinary, a presence, gentle and loving, that seemed to emanate from the light itself. He could not see her clearly, his vision was too far gone, but he knew who it was. Elisabeth. Somehow impossibly she was there, reaching for him across the boundary between life and death. "I am coming," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Wait for me, my love. I am finally coming home." His heart beat once more, strong and sure, then fell still. His breathing ceased. Vlad Dracula, who had been born a prince and died a monster, and finally died again as a man, passed from the world in sunlight and forgiveness. Elena held him as he died, her tears falling on his face, and she spoke a prayer in Latin over his body. When the transformation was complete, when the last spark of supernatural taint had burned away, his body began to age rapidly. 400 years of suspended aging caught up to him all at once, his face lined and weathered. His hair turned fully white. His body took on the appearance of a man who had lived a full natural span. Within minutes, all that remained was the corpse of an old man who appeared to have died peacefully in his sleep. Elena remained with him for a long time, sitting in the sunlight on the tower platform, holding the body of a man who had been a monster and had fought his way back to humanity. She thought about Elisabeth, about 10 generations of her family keeping faith with a promise made by a dying woman. She thought about the 800 victims whose names Dracula had spoken, whose deaths he had acknowledged and mourned. She thought about the courage it took to face such darkness and choose light anyway. When she finally rose, the sun was high in the sky. She arranged Dracula's body with care, folding his hands across his chest, closing his eyes. Then she descended from the tower to find his servants, those strange bound creatures who had served him for so long. She expected them to be hostile, to blame her for their master's death, but instead they seemed almost relieved. "Is it done?" the oldest servant asked, a woman who looked ancient beyond measure. "Is he finally at rest?" "He is," Elena confirmed. "The curse is broken. He died as a man in sunlight, forgiven and redeemed." The servant nodded slowly. "Then our service is complete as well. The contracts that bound us were tied to his curse. With it broken, we are free." She looked at Elena with something like gratitude. "Thank you for bringing him peace. He was not always a monster. Once, long ago, he was a good man. We remember that man, and we are glad he found his way back to himself at the end." Over the following days, Elena worked with the servants to give Dracula a proper burial. They laid him to rest in the family crypt beside Elisabeth's tomb, reuniting the lovers who had been separated for 4 centuries. The servants performed old rituals to sanctify the ground, to ensure that no curse could ever rise from this place again. And when the work was done, they simply vanished, their contracts fulfilled, released at last from their long servitude. Elena remained at the castle for one more night, walking the halls and library where so much pain and redemption had unfolded. She gathered up the ancient books, the ritual materials, Elisabeth's locket and letter. These things would be preserved by her family, passed down through the generations as a reminder that even the deepest darkness could be transformed by love and courage and the willingness to face one's own evil. On the morning of her departure, she visited the crypt one final time. She stood before the twin tombs, reading the inscriptions that had been carved into the stone. On Elisabeth's tomb, the words were simple: "Beloved wife, faithful unto death." On Dracula's newly carved stone, the servants had inscribed something different. Vlad Dracula, Prince of Wallachia, lost to darkness, reclaimed by light. May he rest in peace beside the woman who never stopped believing in him. Elena placed a single white rose on each tomb, then spoke aloud to the silent dead. "You did it," she said softly. "Both of you. Elisabeth, your faith was not misplaced. Vlad, your courage was sufficient. You proved that redemption is possible even after centuries of damnation, that love can bridge the chasm between life and death, that it is never too late to choose light over darkness. May you rest together now, in whatever peace awaits beyond this world." She left the castle as the sun climbed high, the ancient fortress already beginning to show signs of decay now that its master was gone. Within a generation, it would be nothing but ruins, reclaimed by the forest, haunted only by the memory of the vampire who had once dwelled there, and the miracle of his redemption. But the story would be remembered. Eleanor would write it all down, every detail of the 3 nights and the transformation at dawn. Her family would preserve the account, passing it down through the generations. And perhaps, in some future age when darkness seemed overwhelming and evil appeared triumphant, someone would read this story and remember that no soul is beyond saving. Remember that forgiveness is possible even for the worst sins. Remember that love endures beyond death, and that courage can transform even the deepest darkness into light. In the crypt beneath the ruins, 2 bodies rested side by side, the prince and his princess, reunited at last after 4 centuries of separation. And if the wind sometimes carried whispers through the fallen stones, if travelers occasionally reported seeing 2 figures walking hand in hand through the ruins at sunset, if white roses bloomed impossibly around the sealed entrance to the crypt, well, perhaps some loves truly were eternal, transcending even the boundaries between this world and whatever lay beyond. The curse was broken, the monster was redeemed, and in the end, love had proven stronger than death, stronger than darkness, stronger than 400 years of damnation. That was the truth that mattered, the story worth preserving, the hope worth carrying forward into whatever darkness the future might hold. Some souls were lost beyond finding, but Vlad Dracula had proven that some souls, no matter how far they fell, could still find their way home.